microphone. Let me turn on the microphone.
Yeah, it's all right.
Thanks everybody for coming to the, I don't know which annual meeting this is, but another meeting of the W3C Music Notation Community Group at Musikmesse. And thanks to Elena DeLonga, who I met for the first time just a few minutes ago. After corresponding with her via email for many years, she's the main staff person at Musikmesse who sets up these meetings and provides the room space for us free of charge, which we're very grateful for. And thanks to Dominic and Capella for sponsoring the reception that we will have in a couple of hours. Is there anybody here who is new, who wandered in from Music Tech Fest or is otherwise new to the Music Notation Community Group? So, okay, I will go over this slide then. We were founded almost 4 years ago. Joe Berkovitz, formerly of Noteflight, and Hal Leonard was instrumental in setting up the W3C group as a place that was vendor independent, vendor neutral for developing and maintaining format and language specifications for notated music used by web, mobile, and desktop applications. So we maintain and update the MusicXML and standard music font layout, aka SMuFL specifications. And we are also developing a new spec codenamed MNX to handle new use cases and technologies. With the success of MusicXML and SMuFL, people now want standard music formats to do more than those formats were originally designed to do. So MNX is a next generation project to handle the increased demands that software developers, publishers, and musicians are placing on standard music notation formats. Community group membership is free of charge. It does not require W3C membership, which is good because the W3C is a great organization, but it's also rather expensive to join. So the community group is free to join, and if you do want to contribute to MusicXML and MNX, please, please, please join the group because we need the intellectual property releases and things that come from being a community group member before we can incorporate your contributions into any of the standards for the group. So the URL is right there. The agenda for the meeting, right after this slide, we'll go around the room. If people can just say their name and what organization they're working from, if any, so that we've had a lot of discussions via email over the past year, and people, this is a great way to associate names with the faces of folks. After that, we'll have an introduction from Dominique and our reception sponsor, Capella Software. We'll then have an introduction from Adrian, our new co-chair of the community group. Daniel will discuss SMuFL 1.4 plans. I'm Michael Good. I'll discuss MusicXML 3.2 plans. And where is Matthias? I've never met Matthias. Fantastic. Matthias will be introducing the Daisy Braille Music Group to us. Adrian will then do lead discussions on MNX, issues of the relationship between MNX-Common and MNX-Generic, and the ever popular issue that we do want to resolve soon so we can move on to other issues of sounding and written pitch in MNX. I noticed nobody seems to have brought tomatoes, so that's a For introductions, I'm Michael Good. I'm at MakeMusic. We're doing the introduction.
Okay. Yeah, my name is Dominic Kernel and I'm the CEO of Capella Software.
Magnus Lundholm. I just play music and needed a little player and made a program to play music XML.
My name is James Ingram, codename Notator from GitHub, and I was Guy Stockhausen's copyist for 25 years, and I've been programming since 1982.
My name is Bernd Jungmann. I'm a senior programmer at Capella Software, and
my name is Markus Hüttenthal. I'm also a programmer for Capella Software.
My name is Dorian Zibusch, and I'm Informatiker from Capella.
I'm Martin Reiniger and CEO of Sound Mutation. We are an online music transcription service.
My name is Matthias Leopold. I'm working at the German Central Library for the Blind, and I am working on Braille music notation.
Hi, I'm Simon Barko, and I work for the Lugard Verlag, and we developed the software Forte and the music notation scanning software called ScanScore.
My name is Tom Nauman. I'm the Chief Publications Officer for MusicNotes.com.
Heiko Petersen, I'm a musician and editor for different publications.
James Sutton of Dolphin Computing. We do C-Score and PlayScore.
I'm Christina Knoll. I'm a programmer for MusicNotes.com.
Johannes Kepper, Music Encoding Initiative, MEI.
My name is Gerhard Mühlritter from MusicAlien.com, online music library.
My name is Christoph Schad, maker of the music notation program, editor Primus.
I'm Martin Maris from Nutcraft Europe. We're a small music engraving company, and we've been involved with major publishers in conversion of their files to XML and various other formats.
Hi, Carsten Gundermann, freelancing composer from Hamburg.
I'm Alex, I am present. I'm Bob Hamlock, used to be founder of Neostores, the product of Gustav. Now it's bankrupt, so it's finished. So I'm the consultant in the industry.
Hello, I'm Cyril Coutelier. I'm co-founder and engraving programmer for Flat.io, music notation software.
Hello, I'm Dominique van den Heuker. I'm working, I developed the Pizzicato music software, and I'm now working with MakeMusic to develop the smart music ecosystem in the web.
I'm Daniel, and I head up a new innovation lab at Ultimate Guitar and MuseScore.
I'm Dominic Svoboda from Czech Republic. I'm beta tester of Notation Composer and Dorico.
I'm Reinhold Hoffmann from Notation Software. That's the company with www.notation.com.
It's a bit of a humble brag, isn't it? I'm Daniel Spreadbury. I'm from Steinberg.
I'm Adrian Holovaty from Soundslice.
Great, thank you. We have one more person to. We just did introductions. That's Frank. So now we will have an introduction.
An introduction to Capella from Dominic Herman.
Thank you, Michael. Welcome to Capella MusicXML. So what does Capella stand for? Capella Software has been creating software around music notation for almost 30 years now, and we create easy to use and intuitive music software at moderate prices. And our software is aimed at individuals, music groups, and associations in the amateur and professional area. So we are sometimes asked, how does it come that Capella is just written with one P and not with two P as it is a cappella in music? So here's the explanation. So when Capella was originally developed, it was not derived from the Italian word capella, but from Capella, which is a bright shining star in the sky, in the constellation Auriga. More exactly, it's not a single star, but it's a whole star system. So, in that sense, these are our Capella stars. As you can see, it's a bundle of programs all arranged around our main program, which is Capella. And if you're looking a bit closer at these programs, we can see that almost all of these programs are dealing with MusicXML. Some are just reading, some are just writing, and we have some programs which are doing both reading and writing MusicXML. And I will just do a quick tour through some of these programs. So our main program, as I already said, is Capella, which is our notation program, and which comes with the newest version, which is version 8, comes with a completely redesigned user interface, which we try to optimize for usability. This program is available for Windows and Mac. Next one. We have Capella Scan, which is our program dealing to scan music from paper or from PDF. And as you can see in the picture, the green color shows the recognized symbols in the score. Next, we have Capella Melody Trainer, which is thought to analyze your singing and playing, and it shows deviations of your performance from the score. And we have another program called Tonica. Tonica is our composition program, so it composes and analyzes music and different sorts of music like scores, variations, accompanying patterns, canons, figured bars, and even simple fugues. Next one is Capella WaveKit. Capella WaveKit has a task to analyze and recognize notes from audio recordings and bring them into music notation. And finally, I'd like to mention our Capella Reader. Capella Reader, you can use Capella Reader for reading your music and for practicing your part. And current version is available for Windows and Mac. And we are currently beta testing the two versions for Android and iOS, which will be soon available in the Apple and Google Store. So, going from MusicXML to MNX, I would like to say that we at Capella Software are following and occasionally also contributing to the MNX discussions with great interest. I would like to say thanks to Joe, also he's not here anymore in his function, and thank him for his great pioneering work on MNX, but at the same time, I'd like to say a big welcome to Adrian for taking up and continuing Joe's work. Yeah, basically that's it. We are looking forward very much to discussions on this topic, which we'll have later. And thank you for your interest, and I give back to Michael.
Great, thank you, Dominic. Before we go on to the SMuFL discussion, give a moment for Adrian to introduce himself to the group as our new co-chair.
Hi everybody, I am delighted to be here. I've been here the previous 3 or maybe 4 years, so I recognize many of you. Just some quick background for those of you who don't know me. I work on a website called Soundslice that does music education stuff, and it has a music notation rendering engine, so that's how I originally got involved in this area, and we also consume and produce MusicXML. In my other life as a programmer, I was one of the creators of the Django web framework, which is for the Python programming language, which I've thankfully retired from as one of the benevolent dictators for life. That was like a second full-time job. And perhaps now I have another second full-time job. So I'm very glad to continue the work that Joe started on MNX and help move that forward, specifically with all the community thoughts in mind to make as good of a format for interchange and for the new use cases as possible. So, thanks. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Adrian. We'll now hand it over. What was it? We'll now hand it over to Daniel for a discussion of SMuFL.
Yes, which I'll have to take notes of what I said in a minute. So yeah, we finished SMuFL 1.3, published the community report, which is like the final output of that version of SMuFL at the beginning of March. Took a bit longer than it should have done, but we got there in the end. obviously I went over what was new in it in our last meeting at NAMM, so I won't dwell on that. But there are some really good new ranges in there, and especially those bigger ones, in particular for car notation and for German organ tablature. They were contributed by members of the community group who did all of the difficult work of arranging all of the characters into the right ranges, describing them, and even doing sample versions of the glyphs as well, which made my life incredibly easy. So a huge vote of thanks to those contributors who brought those ranges into SMuFL 1.3. If we go to the next slide, we can talk more interestingly about what might come next. So we are planning to do a SMuFL 1.4, probably to be contained within this calendar year. There are around 30 issues in the GitHub repository at the moment. As you know, that's sort of officially where stuff happens. And the ones that I've decided so far to bring into scope for SMuFL 1.4 is about half of them. And this isn't a comprehensive list of the things that are currently in that list, but it gives you an idea of the sort of things. So one idea from indeed Dominic sitting behind me was to provide in the font metadata, which is the JSON file that every SMuFL font should come with, to have the idea of allowing the designer to specify what text font family would make a good pairing with the music font that you're working on, which I think is a good idea. There are some also, as you see, expanding the beamed groups of notes range, which is the one that you can use for sort of drawing texty combinations of notes for things like rhythmic indications and so on. Chromatic solfege is actually quite a big area, and again, probably there are people in this room who've contributed stuff to that, to the pair of issues that we have in the SMuFL repository about that. But I think that will be very helpful additions for music education. And then finally, we've also had a pretty detailed proposal for how to add the necessary glyphs for numbered notation or Jampu notation, which, you know, in a way, there's sort of a bit of a question mark over putting it into SMuFL because it mostly just uses numeric characters, but there are some other marks, of course, that go along with the Jampu to give additional semantic information. So I think on balance it does make sense to include it. And there are a handful of other issues as well. It's very easy to look at them if you want to. You just go to the GitHub page for SMuFL, go to issues, and then there's a little milestones menu there. You just click SMuFL 1.4 in there. And as I say there, we welcome any further proposals, and indeed I welcome any proposals that might be in the room now, or any questions about SMuFL and how things are going. We did in our January meeting at NAMM also, for example, give a list of the available fonts that are currently out there that are SMuFL compliant, which I refer you back to rather than going over again here, because it hasn't changed since January, as far as I know anyway. But yeah, if there are any other questions about SMuFL, I'm happy to take them. Alex.
My annual question.
Oh yes.
What's the glyph count?
What's the what?
The glyph count.
Oh, I don't know, 3,500 and something? Quite high, but I can't remember the exact. That's a number I should just be able to pull out of my brain, but I'm afraid I don't know. If you leave it with me, I can get you the exact number, but I'd have to go and count.
Well, I can do that myself.
Very good. Okay, that's true. It'd be quicker if I do it, but maybe it'll keep you quiet, so yes, you go and count them. Good. Any other questions? No, that's good. Okay, I hand the microphone back to Michael.
Great, thank you, Daniel. So now we'll have a discussion of MusicXML 3.2, and I'm just checking our timing to make sure we're going on schedule, which is good. So in the past, we had said we wanted to get MusicXML 3.1 done so that we could then focus on MNX development work. And now we're saying, well, in addition to MNX development work, we'd like to do a MusicXML 3.2. So why the change here? Why do a MusicXML 3.2? There's still room for improvement in MusicXML's core use cases for music notation exchange and archiving. This isn't an attempt to get into any of the new use cases that MNX does, but to just improve what is going on as we try to use MusicXML in its just standard normal use. And at any point, if people in the community believe there is something that is missing, that is critical for getting things done, business problems that you're running into, or problems in academic projects that you're running into, there's always the opportunity to do proposals, and as we see what is coming up for issues that people are raising, we can decide then to do a new MusicXML release in parallel with MNX. Our work on MNX is not making MusicXML obsolete. The two are going on in parallel and will evolve in parallel, we expect, for quite some time. The issue that is of particular interest, certainly to MakeMusic and I believe to many other folks, is to have better support for parts in addition to score and the relationship between score and parts. I'll be going into more detail on that in the next slide. There are, however, several issues that have come up that are popular requests for MusicXML that turn out to be things that, yes, it would be great to have them, but MusicXML's design really isn't meant to handle that type of feature. And for things that would make MusicXML harder to understand and harder to work with if we implemented them there, those are the type of issues that we say, yeah, it'd be better to postpone that and deal with that in MNX-Common. Let's design that in from the beginning in a new format that doesn't have the same compatibility restrictions as MusicXML, and get those things right there. And I'll give some examples of those type of issues in the next slide as well. So the current plans, and this is all subject to change and discussion, the reason we're talking about this here is to get community feedback that doesn't make sense to be working on MusicXML 3.2, and if so, do these seem to be the right things to be working on? Should we be working on some other things instead? Or in addition, are there some things here that maybe we shouldn't be working on? But there are now 20 open issues in the v3.2 milestone on GitHub, and they tend to be focused on three main themes. The better support for parts, where most scores, most notation editors represent scores and they represent parts and the relationships between the two, but a MusicXML document currently just does a score or it just does a part. And if you have two MusicXML documents, one for a score, one for a part, there's no standard way to indicate the relationship between them. You can hack a relationship between them, but we don't want hacks. We want something that is standard that any application that deals with both score and parts can use to communicate back and forth that information with other MusicXML applications. So better for support for parts, better XML tool support. This includes things like XML catalogs and use with XML code generation tools. MusicXML was designed before there were code generation tools for XML schemas. It was designed actually before XML schemas were a final W3C standard. So when you run MusicXML through these tools, whether they be JAXB or other standard code generators that bind a MusicXML XML schema data to code in your application programming language, most people are running into issues where the design of MusicXML confuses the schema generator. And it usually turns out that there's a pretty standard way to work around those limitations, except they're never documented anywhere, so everybody has to discover them for the first time. And let's mitigate the problem as much as possible and document what the approach is to work with the code generation tools. XML catalogs are also a technology for providing better support for a local version of the MusicXML schema. If you want to do validation on the user device, you don't want to ping our musicxml.org site over the net, which is not on MakeMusic's fastest web server, as you may have noticed. So you'd like to have a local version, and XML catalogs are a standard way to do that. We should figure out a standard way to have that supported for MusicXML. There are some suggestions, and also clarify documentation of several features. That's I assume that item is going to be in every MusicXML revision, because there's always something that, as people gain more experience, things that could be clarified in the documentation in the schema for how a MusicXML feature works. Now, examples of common suggestions that we're currently postponing to MNX-Common because they don't really fit in with the design of MusicXML is improving semantics for general text and improving semantics for bracket and lines. This often comes up in the context of guitar notation. And the way MusicXML was designed is basically that a marking on text basically corresponds to a single MusicXML element. In SMuFL, there's a different approach where this, symbols that can look very similar to each other or identical actually have different identities based on their usage within a document. So those graphic symbols, the text can, the lines can contain more semantic information. That's a great approach, but it's not the approach MusicXML took, and trying to wedge that into MusicXML doesn't seem like necessarily a great idea. So it's something that we'd like to postpone to MNX-Common. We might be able to do some things in terms of improving playback techniques that go with text, but that's not quite the same level of really saying semantically this text means palm, for instance, or the text or the line in combination indicates a palm muting. You may say there's a playback technique, but not exactly the same. It'd be great to have those semantics, but it'd be great to have them in MNX-Common. And of course, anything that comes up that would break compatibility with older MusicXML versions, we still want to maintain that if you have a MusicXML 1.0 file, it's going to be a valid MusicXML 3.2 file. That type of compatibility is really valuable for archival applications and just to make sure that your MusicXML doesn't get rendered obsolete. We will tackle the challenge of going to an incompatible format with MNX and building converters, and that'll be a very interesting topic to address with MNX-Common, but not something we want to address here. We currently don't have a firm release date planned, but looking at the type of things that are involved and schedules that people have, it seems like sometime in 2020 would be a reasonable target date for MusicXML 3.2 to be released. I already discussed these parts. I forgot that I had the more detail in here. But I did not discuss the proposed solution in terms of how to address this. I have a prototype of this actually that we've developed for Finale, which we expect to ship with the next release of Finale, which is that you take, in order to do this part relationship, you use a compressed MusicXML file, which is a zip file that has some standard indications about where to find a MusicXML score. So you include a full copy of the score and then a full copy of all the parts that are associated with the score. You then put a link in the MusicXML score file that says which of these part files in the zip file corresponds to a score part in a MusicXML file. That's the missing part in MusicXML 3.1. You can't actually link from a score part element to anything else. So the technical solution actually there is fairly easy. For our proof of concept, we're using an XML processing instruction, which works as a hack. But again, we don't want a hack. We want a semantic way to do the representation. With this type of representation, you can then, the MusicXML file will have all the information about the score and parts, and then each reading application can handle it differently and decide what information from the parts do you want to maintain, and you can bring that information in whichever technique you use to maintain the differences between score and parts, because those technologies vary a great deal among different applications, although conceptually they all look, they're very similar and have been around since Mosaic, at least Composer's Mosaic had their part function way back when. Another related set of issues is how to, okay, say I have just an existing MusicXML text file, I don't want to use a compressed file, I like the text version. We can still make things better in terms of supporting importing a MusicXML file and creating parts. In particular, we can, if you have a concert score, we can specify the transpositions for the parts. We need to do that in a way that doesn't confuse the heck out of any MusicXML 3.0 program reading it that doesn't have this feature, but we should be able to specify, that a part that is not part of the score actually has this type of transposition. and if you have a tempo mark or other type of notation that appears on the top staff of the score or the top staff of each individual part to indicate that this is something on the top staff. And we probably do that for the bottom staff as well for things like measure numbering, which often appears on the bottom staff of a particular part or score. Again, this is just the initial proposal for the design. It is not at all baked in stone, and all these issues are open. They have not been implemented. There are no pull requests or anything yet. We haven't actually started the MusicXML 3.2 development. We're just doing design work at this point. So for the next steps, I'd like to open it up for discussion on the floor. To get a sense from the group here, does proceeding with MusicXML 3.2 along with MNX-Common seem like a good idea? If we decide that we do want to do this, my invitation to you is that now is the time to write up your favorite MusicXML issues for possible inclusion in 3.2, if they're not already there. And also, are there any other major areas to work on for this release? I know I've had discussions with some of the folks here about possible additional topics for MusicXML 3.2, so it'd be good to get those out for more general discussion. And as we go forward, assuming that we do go forward with MusicXML 3.2, I would plan to create an MNX, either a milestone or a tag in GitHub to clearly indicate issues that we're targeting for MNX-Common, and then probably close those issues to indicate these are things that they're great issues, we're considering them, but they seem more appropriate to MNX-Common. And before closing them, we'd make sure that they actually are in the MNX issue repository. So with that, I'd like to open it up for comments and questions, and we can hand the microphone around as people want to talk. They did give us a second microphone, but it doesn't work.
I can try it again.
I guess the first question on should we do it is how fast are we going to get MNX 1.0 out, and how much of these are problems? Because if we can't get MNX 1.0 out by 2020, then and everybody needs these bugs fixed, and I don't know, I'm looking at all the issues with MNX and it probably won't. Then we probably ought to do a maintenance release, I guess is the best way of putting it, as we keep moving forward. But if we're going to all get all of our differences resolved by next year on MNX, then we should, focus our energies there. So what's
I think you brought up a very good point. So it's not when we get MNX out, it's also when do the major supplier are able to have MNX implemented and available. And also it is important not only when it's available, but there is a lot of music out there in XML, in MusicXML. So from my point of view, and we did a huge investment into MusicXML over years, for me both formats will exist in parallel. And if this is given and we agree that this exists in parallel, we have a different discussion, because one discussion is MusicXML will exist, and what is the timeline of MNX? And this is something which I took in my pocket to bring it up over here, to have a common sense of how this world will look in the future. So it's a question, maybe not to answer now, but I fully agree. It's not only when MNX is out, but when will the major supplier have MNX implemented in export and import?
Oh, John wants that first.
I'll do a quick thought on it. I think a crucial part of this will be getting an automated converter from MusicXML to MNX, so that if you want to ingest files, at least on the importing side, you can then have a single bit of code that handles both formats. So if you get MusicXML, it will get converted to MNX, and you can deal with MNX. If you get MNX, you can just deal directly with MNX. So that seems like a reasonable way forward for getting that. It is a chicken and egg situation, for sure. But yeah, I think an automated importer is definitely crucial. And that's something that I personally will be excited to develop once we actually know what MNX will be.
Just my thoughts on the timeline. And my co-chairs can take a different opinion. My point of view is that I would really doubt if we could get the MNX-Common. We might start, I think it's reasonable to have a draft specification for MNX-Common by 2020, but not, I think for it to be completed, well, it would take then another year or so, past that at least, is my guess. But
Adrian is disagreeing.
I don't know. Yeah, I think once we work out some of the more difficult issues, which we'll be discussing in a few minutes, a lot of the details of music notation do not get people super passionate, to put it simply. So I think it's just a matter of making a decision. For this particular notation, it will be like this. For this particular notation, it will be like this, where it's not controversial at all. And I think with that, it's just a matter of crossing our T's and dotting our I's. Fortunately, we already have with MusicXML a pretty comprehensive list of notations that should be handled in some way. So for the timeline, I'm a little bit more optimistic, but famous last words. It's something, I would like something to happen in 2020, for sure.
I think Daniel had yes.
Yeah, the first point on this, I guess, that I wanted to make here is that, well, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens coexisted for a long time. And I think this is kind of what we're looking at here, is there are some incredible use cases for MNX, but not all the use cases that you would utilize MusicXML for, MNX would be appropriate for. So the idea also here is this was brought up, that you have large repositories in places, and you have a lot of documents and a lot of resources that are available in MusicXML, and the transfer of that is a whole other separate issue. So one is the definition, the adoption, and then the conversion, as I see, of three separate and distinct phases of moving into MNX. And so as we consider this, I have a couple of questions that come up. End of 2019, end of 2020, any of those things, anytime in 2020 seems like a century away. And when you're looking at wanting to develop solutions that could potentially be more broadly applicable, wondering what is the possibility to accelerate some of that. And in my mind, can there be, I think of this as, I don't see a hard stop of MusicXML and then a sudden adoption. I don't know if that's really appropriate at all. But maybe there are several more versions of MusicXML beyond 3.2. And could that be broken up into smaller fragments and released more frequently?
Yeah, the acceleration of the development happens in part by either reducing the scope of and doing more frequent releases, as you suggest, and getting more contributors to the MusicXML format. If it's 90% my work, then that moves slower than if we have more contributors. But we certainly, 2020 was a guess. We could certainly talk about moving that in so that it's more end of 2019 than 2020. It needs to be. We want to release it after it's been implemented and tested, and that the product, and in several different implementations, and that product cycle takes a while to get through. Because once we release it, because of the compatibility factor, we can't do the move fast and break things, because if we break things in a release, it's like broken for eternity. But try not to break things for eternity.
Taking a step backwards, I don't understand why you need a set of parts included with your score, which contains a set of parts.
Because I can speak to our issue in going from the Finale application to the Smart Music application. So you have the score formatting, and in the Finale file, there's both score formatting and parts formatting. And currently, all that's communicated if you're uploading a file from Finale into Smart Music is the score formatting. So we automatically generate the parts using, good data, but customers complain about that because they spent a lot of time tweaking the part formatting to have particular system breaks, or they have a particular page size that isn't necessarily the standard page size that we guessed, or the page size that's in the score, or things are positioned differently in the score and in the part. So there are a lot of formatting types of differences in particular that can be different between the score and the part. And Notation Program A knows that. We should be able, in a single file, to communicate those differences over to Notation Program B.
But not by duplicating the data. Presumably you're duplicating all the notes between the two things. So that if somebody comes along and edits one of them and doesn't edit the other, or edits it slightly differently, inadvertently, then you may. What you could do is have a different sort of type of notation that attaches to the score that refers to the part.
Right. That is certainly another way to do it. That is the way that most notation programs handle it individually. That type of design gets really complicated because there are tons and tons of differences. So instead of trying to figure out how do we represent all these different things that could be different between the score and the part, the simpler way that is, it also has the complete data, is just to include a copy of it. It's certainly not the way that we would recommend anybody implement that type of feature natively. But again, MusicXML isn't trying to be a native format. It's trying to be an interchange format. So if we include the full data, sure, a lot of it is redundant, but at least we make sure we get everything, and we can get it out a lot quicker than if we try to do a differencing.
That's the difference between how MNX would handle it and how MusicXML is probably going to handle it.
Yeah, I would never propose this for how MNX would handle it.
It means that generating the parts is a one-way trip. Once you've generated the parts, you don't want to then go back to edit the score and regenerate the parts if you put a lot of work into these individual parts layouts.
Well, it depends. I mean, that depends on how each program handles that type of information. But yeah, the exchange usually happens after you have done a certain level of completion of the data, because as wonderful as MusicXML is, it's never going to be perfect, and you're always going to lose information. So the more you transfer back and forth, the more information gets lost over time. So I don't think in practice that's going to be too much of an issue.
I'm actually rather in favour of continuing MusicXML as a separate project. But I think we need to be very clear where the interface is between these two projects. For example, you said in issue 278, can you go back to the slide?
I'll see if I can. I think I can. Yes.
Yeah, 278. You want to include the full score copy of all the parts within zip file MXL file. MNX-MXL?
MXL, that's the standard suffix for the compressed file.
I misread that. What I was going to say, that your concept for the compressed music XML format, mixed format, shouldn't be confused with the container format in MNX.
Oh no, yeah, those are different. That's already
This
exists.
is something which is very important, that the two projects know how their interface functions.
Yes.
That when you're doing updating MusicXML, you know what's going on in MNX, and you don't trespass. Right? So, I mean, that's just very important. And I think Adrian's also quite right, that the existence of a translation mechanism is extremely important, because if you are developing MusicXML, at some point you're going to arrive, we don't know if MNX is going to succeed at all. It might fail, or it might just be in 10 years' time. So we need MusicXML to be better and better. And at that point, it will immediately get translated. So there's no problem.
I see all your arguments for separate files, for scores and parts, but if you want a nearly fully integrated set of data in the target program, you are facing the problem of dynamically linked structures between score and parts. Do you see any solution for creating this in this kind of import format? May it be some future version of XML or MNX? Because if somebody imports something from program A to program B, of course he also would love to have the benefit of re-editing later and having this dynamic link retained, which can't be done if it's separate sets of data.
That we already have implemented that for the next version of Finale, the next maintenance update of Finale. So we have an implementation. It doesn't do it the clean way because that doesn't exist in MusicXML 3.2, so we have to use processing instructions instead of language features. But we are exporting, if you take Finale 26.1, when that comes out, and you export from the score and you use this option to include the linked parts, and then you re-import that into Finale, it re-imports with that linkage. And we have also done a test implementation of that for Smart Music as well. So we have 2 test implementations where we are able to do that type of linkage and generate it from, even though they are duplicates in the MusicXML file, the importing program can read the data and create the linkages appropriately for that format. So I'm pretty convinced that this is something that can work with any program that chooses to implement that feature. And we can test that hypothesis, and we certainly do want to test that hypothesis during the 3.2 work to make sure it's not just something that MakeMusic programs can do, but that programs from any vendor can do.
Fantastic. Wow.
So if I can summarize what I think I am hearing, there seems to be general support for continuing MusicXML development on with MNX. We should be careful not to get carried away with the MusicXML development. We're trying to have targeted maintenance releases that fix particular problems of high import, and we do want to be able to maintain focus on MNX-Common so we can get that out as soon as possible, but we should be able to do both simultaneously. Does that sound like a fair assessment of what I'm hearing in this room? Okay, that's good because that matches roughly what we heard at the NAM meeting. So it's good to check in, and that seems to have been what it seemed like online, but it's always great to have these discussions face to face because things can come out in different ways there. Thank you very much for the discussion on MusicXML. And we are now ready to move to next steps. Just one more. I thought, I already had done this slide because I had gone back. We are now ready to move to Matthias, who will give us an introduction to the DAISY consortium on the Braille music.
I'm working for blind musicians. It's an international standard that has been invented by Braille himself, who was an organist in Paris. And we have the problem that there are different institutions in the world that transcribe Braille music or make Braille music from ink print. And these institutions get less money, and the people who do this transcription get older, and we will have the problem in some years that there are no more people left or less people left that can make these transcriptions. So we have the goal to completely automate this transcription. And there's something special about this. Normally, if you have music scores, it's very optically. So you have relations between music notation symbols that have an optical relation. But in Braille music, they have exact relations. So you have very close concept of stuff. For example, if you put some numbers above a chord, then you have a fingering. But in Braille, you have an exact positioning of a fingering to each note. And this is something that is very complicated for us because the scores are very optically. So we hope to have a good way to have more or better expression of relation of symbols to different notes. And we have made a list of some things that make problems to us at the moment, and we hope to get progress with it.
Next slide.
Okay. I was now speaking freely, so can
okay.
I just switch back? I wasn't aware that what was my slides. Okay. But it's the same that I said, yes, okay, then you can switch. Yes, there are some special point accessible developments in notation or music software highly welcome. That's about, there are some software that are partially accessible to blind musicians, like Capella has been for a long time, but the problem is that if a musician wants to deal with notation software, like for example Sibelius, it's always complicated. So we would like to have would be a good idea to have an accessible software, like for example Steinberg would be of interest. But anyway, main thing is this sheet music. So we print music in Braille because it's like a matrix, and they can orientate in vertically and horizontally on this paper, and this is something very important for a blind musician. So sheet music will be very important for the future too. Okay, next slide. So this is key people. It has been an initiative of Arne Kirkebo from the National Library for the Blind in Norway, and they made this project, and it's just like to find out which possibilities they have and which ways to come to good results. And they're helping who is a Chinese composer who is really brilliant and who has invested lots of time to get these things in progress. Okay. As I said, so the input file should be as good as possible. That's the problem for us. As I said, we have the problem of optical and context assignments. As a fingering example, as I said, there are a lot of things like these, for example, with wedges. If you have a wedge, singing notes, on one note you can get a crescendo and afterwards a decrescendo, which is optically shown, in which, for example, if you have a whole note, you have for the first half you have a crescendo and afterwards decrescendo, and this has to be written very exactly in Braille notation. But in imprint it's just wedge up, wedge down, and just put somewhere with some coordinates. This is something which is, for example, a big problem to us. Yes, the conversion markup tools should be very accurate. At the moment we have the idea to give such kind of notes which are not very clear to some companies in India who will make a closer check-up and to find out the problems and to make it more in detail. But we have the problem that we need things to express it cannot be expressed with MusicXML at the moment. And yes, the third point, good access to existing intermediary files. Of course, we have the problem also that we get. You have to imagine don't have easy access to Inkprint as a Braille user, so we have to scan in the notes. So best way for Braille user is to have electronic files which can be converted, and these files are often not as exact as they should be. And you have to imagine these are professional musicians, so they earn their money with making music, and so there must not be unclear situations in these notes. And afterwards we also have problems with teaching materials and so on. So this is our focus, and we are, as I said, we have the problem with we need more exact material and more exact notation and so on. Okay, that's all.
Great. Thank you, Matthias. Are there questions for him?
One question. As a developer, is there like a tool where I can check whether my XML is exact enough for you? Well, how can I evaluate this?
We want to develop a tool that can check if the notation is exact enough, but the problem is that how can you know? For example, if you have a fingering and it's somewhere written with some voices and you have a fingering, how can a software decide if it's correctly for the correct notes or not? So somebody who's playing the notes will know automatically which is a correct assignment, but the software, it's difficult.
Yeah, just one, not necessarily so much a question, but a comment. There is an initiative that maybe we can connect on, where there is actually an open issue right now with MuseScore on this very specific topic about MusicXML and Braille. And I mean, it's ongoing right now. Like as of last week, it was started. So there is some Braille support in a project with open scores. So it's open Braille. And so just connect with me after and we'll get you connected with that.
One thing I do remember it's got nothing to do with blind users, but it's a similar issue, was that when I was trying to access the Sibelius interface, starting with Sibelius 7, it was written using a Nokia system that I could no longer access the screen in an automated fashion, so that was another issue that we had. I wasn't at that point trying to develop anything with the blind, I was simply trying to manipulate Sibelius on third-party software, and the interface became opaque.
I know that there are some blind persons who use Sibelius, but I've never really seen them using it, so I don't know where are the problems with it, but I know it's the most, as far as I know, the most accessible of these software.
Any other questions regarding the DAISY project and Braille music? Okay, thank you, and we will hand it over to Adrian for what you all came here for, the MNX discussions.
You could be anywhere.
Hi everybody, just to give some quick context, MNX was the brainchild of Joe Berkowitz, who's no longer involved in the community. He has become a grandfather and a sculptor.
Yep, a successful sculptor. His art career took off way faster than he expected after he retired. So
It was very
great.
He does have a website, I think, with some of his art on it. So anyway, I've spent the last few months getting up to speed, and I wanted to give you a quick update on what has been done so far, and I want to end with a very thick and juicy question for discussion. So the first thing that I did was I put together this Introduction to MNX-Common document. For those of you who have been coming to these meetings and participating on GitHub and on the mailing list, it's all old news to you, but I felt that there was something lacking in the just communication about MNX in general. And this very short document is just an overview of what MNX, specifically MNX-Common, is intended to be, why we're doing it. We previously had sort of just jumped into the writing of the spec. So have a look at that if you haven't already. That's on the MNX GitHub page. Next slide, please. Second kind of big thing that we've done recently is we've decided that MNX-Common and MNX-Generic should in fact be two separate formats. Now to give some context on this, originally the plan was that we would have a file called an MNX file that might be a generic SVG kind of thing that represents visuals, or it might be this thing that we're calling MNX-Common that represents the semantics. And it's up to the developer who's consuming the file to figure that out. It'll say like version equals blah, blah, blah. Then you just have to branch based on that. We decided this was not a good idea for 3 reasons. Next one. It's probably way too confusing for end users because then they're going to have to know, is this MNX file a semantic one or a non-semantic one? And just dealing, as somebody who runs a site that lets people upload notation, it's already confusing enough communicating to people that a PDF is not semantic using notation. There's just not, people aren't sophisticated end users, so I think if we had a single format that did both, that would be kind of chaos for end users. The second thing would be also, this is kind of the same, the flip side, for developers, I think probably if we had gone that route, 90%, 95% of developers would only consume one, would only generate one, and just not worry about the other one, like only do the semantic thing, not worry about the SVGs or otherwise. Which again was a loud indicator that this really shouldn't be this part of the same format. And the third thing was, couldn't think of a huge benefit in combining other than there's some shared metadata thing, but that's not really a huge benefit. So as a result of this, we decided that we're going to have 2 separate file formats. I still need to do the work of splitting the specification into 2 separate files, but it's pretty straightforward. Any questions or comments on this?
Are we going to go with 2 separate file formats?
Call it, are we going to call it 2 separate? Yes. This is another confusing thing about MNX is that MNX has always been a code name. And of course, the longer we use the name, it hardens. So I thought about adding a slide, please suggest your names, but then I think we'd spend 5 hours just throwing out names for the formats, but I do think that we're going to have a different name than MNX, MNX-Common, MNX-Generic, different names for those. Hopefully there will be some indication that they're coming from the same group.
We also would like to have that it's a family of specifications because ideally we won't stop at just MNX-Common and MNX-Generic, but we'll be able to provide representations for other types of musical semantics in terms of both older notation styles and non-Western notation styles. And it'd be great to have that be a part of a family of specifications with similar designs and reusable components like metadata as much as possible. And be able to communicate that in a way, that's the communicated in a way that the family resemblance is clear, but that one doesn't get confused with the other. And so,
Exactly.
a tricky issue that I do not have a proposed solution for.
Consistent, yeah, it's kind of a soft goal is to make a consistent API for these, while not being literally the same format. So imagine if you're consuming a web API via REST, there are many endpoints that are technically different, but they can all have the same flavor. So that would be the goal. Any other thoughts on this? Okay. So now the meat, the juiciness. We have a fundamental decision we need to make in MNX that will influence the rest of the design of the format, and that's the question of how to represent pitches. It's a fundamental thing. For instruments that are in concert pitch, like a piano, this is a non-issue. It's an issue for transposing instruments. So on this slide we have the same sounded notes, but it's represented differently depending on whether it's a transposing instrument. The top is a treble clef from a piano, and the bottom is a B-flat clarinet. Not only is the pitch on a different staff line, it's spelled differently, it's also a different key signature. So this is the quick background on this. We have many different options for how we can handle this. Number one, the top thing is unambiguous because it's not a transposing instrument, so that's easy. The second one is what's difficult. So one option is to always store the sounding pitch. So for this, that would be B flat. And again, on the top note, it's unambiguous. I won't even waste any more time talking about it. The bottom one, you would need to specify how to get it back to the transposed note. So this is basically pseudocode. It would be something like transpose equals -2. So that's storing the sounded pitch. Next option would be the written pitch, which is the inverse. So on the bottom note, you would store the C note. And again, you would want, for playback purposes and other purposes, you would need to store the fact that there is a transposition. That's option number 2. And option number 3, just in case you haven't come across this issue on the MNX GitHub, there's number 138, Realizations and Layouts is the title, and it has a very long comment thread with people debating this issue with some old friends from the thread in the room today. And the original proposal way at the top of that thread was something called Realizations, proposed by Joe, where, as far as I understand it, it's a bit vague, but the score and part would be duplicated. One would be a realization of the other. Realization is sort of a term that Joe made up for this. But in continuing this particular example, we would have a score with its pitch, and then we would have a part with its pitch. And therefore you have 2 documents, which is similar to what we were talking about earlier with Michael's proposal for MusicXML, having separate documents and providing some link between them. So that's realizations. And sort of a variant on this is alternate spellings or alternate sounding pitches, where you do not have 2 separate documents. You do have only one note, but for the note you have within it an alternate. So this would be, these are 2 different options, 2 different proposals. One would be where it defaults to the written pitch, and then within it you have this optional sounding pitch. Again, this is pseudocode. Or you can go the other way around and start it with the sounding pitch and then have a written pitch hint in there. This starts to get a little bit more verbose, not as verbose as having 2 separate entire scores, of course, but it's getting a little bit verbose. And onward. Wanted to provide a more complex example, thanks to Michael. on the left we have a concert score, on the right we have the part. Now for a flute, it's not a transposing instrument, so the part is identical to the score. Easy. I wish we could stop there. Unfortunately, we can't. Then we have a B-flat clarinet. It's got a B note on the concert score, and in the part it's spelled C sharp. And the key signature goes from C sharp to D sharp. But an even more interesting example is the third, where you have a tenor sax, which is also a B-flat transposing instrument, but they made an editorial decision in this case to have the key of D-flat instead of C sharp, for enharmonic equivalent, which changes the spellings, but of course it's still a C sharp in the concert score, and they've also opted to change the clef from bass to treble. It's another kind of a decision that you can make in a part. So in providing this example, Michael has thrown a bunch of wrenches into the discussion. So I hope this has been a reasonable overview of the various proposals that have been suggested. Now we have a couple big questions that are almost philosophical more than practical that we need to answer. And this is really what I wanted to get at your thoughts on. The first one is, does MNX encode musical ideas or musical documents? Is this a very philosophical question. If you're a composer, is it what's in your head that we're trying to encode, or is it literally what you wrote down and you're thinking, oh yeah, it's a B-flat, so I got a B-flat clarinet part, so I got to move it down a couple lines. Which of those are we trying to encode? That's a major philosophical question. The second one, which is very closely related, is what do we prioritize between what the performer is seeing and thinking about, or what the audience is hearing? Because regardless of the transposition, the audience is always going to hear what the concert score says. They don't have to know or care that it's a transposing instrument, of course. Yes, and then the third thing, what's the ground truth? It's also very similar to the other questions. Is it the sound? If you take that view, you might argue, well, at the end of the day, the whole point of this is music, which is an oral thing, and the transposition is an implementation detail. Or you could take the argument that the visual display is what we're encoding, and it's more of having a 100% fidelity digital representation of what's on the written page and what a musician is dealing with. Another question to grapple with is readability. If we, this is a point that Michael made on the GitHub thread, if we encode the sounded pitch, then you have a mismatch between, if you're, for instance, doing OMR, optical music recognition software, that you take a picture of a score and it automatically figures out the notes, then you have you're an extra step removed from what you see in the markup and what you see on the page. And is that a problem? Or is it an okay solution for us to say, people don't need to look at the music or at the MNX documents themselves, as long as there's a good reference implementation that they can just stick in for testing and see if it renders exactly as their scan was doing. So that's another issue. And finally, this also gets back to the MusicXML parts versus scores question from earlier. Is it inevitable to have redundancy between the score and the part? The amount of customizations that you make to a part, is that just so rich and so complicated that we might as well just throw our hands up and say, yeah, for parts, let's just have an entirely separate document? Or should we try to have one atomic piece of information for every note and then intelligently say, if you're looking at it via a part, add these transpositions and make these changes? So, that's the meat. Hope you're hungry. The good news is I think this is one of the most difficult aspects of designing the format, and once we've figured this out, a lot of the other things will hopefully fall into place. Famous last words. But yeah, I want to open it to this discussion. We've had a spirited discussion online, which I've loved, but the downside is it hasn't been as many people as I would like. So I know many of you haven't contributed there, so I would love to hear from anybody who has an opinion on this, especially if you haven't already contributed there. And yeah, the floor is open.
Well, philosophically, I think you've got to have one set of data. Data duplication is terrible, and you have a minimum data. So I feel that since music is sound, you should store the written pitch and then say that this is a transposing instrument. And if you want to do the sound,
You mean sound.
sorry, sound. Yeah. But yeah, that's where I think it'd be an absolute mess if you try and duplicate data because you get errors, and then there'd be mismatching. And Michael's case can be handled algorithmically.
Can be
handled algorithmically. So everything can be handled algorithmically as long as you have a minimal set of data that describes the exact scenario.
Yes, I would like the exact opposite. In all this room, we didn't enjoy programming MusicXML parsers and rendering from this. We had a hard time for 15 years to do this, and we suffered from all these shortcomings and all these fractions what vendors gave us an input data, and so and this stemmed from the fact that it was not very enough defined, enough concise what we have to integrate and do, and so everybody exported some things. Michael, you praised it as flexibility. I think the current state gave us an answer how to proceed. And my answer would be give the developers, for whom is MNX, for whom is this readable, human readable format, not end users. End users just want to exchange. But developers have to have a compatible, understandable, and handleable format. And I am glad when I go to XML, we have a page of music to see the direct correspondence between these both and not to be forced to transpose in mind to see what happens here and what I have to look here. For example, if you have a transposition by a third or a fifth, you can have flipping stems, you have slurs in other direction, and then some flattening of slur is another thing to do and to imagine where you have to go, where your coordinates are what are they affecting. So I think make it for developers as joyful as possible, at least now, at last now, to implement this format and to produce documents that every other in this circle has joy to receive and to parse and to display. So give me the meaning of the sheet that I see on the right side in the code on the left side.
But you might display the sound in all written pitch. So as a developer, you don't mind. You just display the pitch that you want to.
If you have it in the program already, okay, you could switch, of course. You can transpose on the fly. But if I have something PDF that the customer sent me, so I'm bound to the representation that I happen to get. And I don't know whether we have the freedom to do this. And I would really love to see this from the practical, not from any philosophical aspects that are, I'm happy to discuss, but no, not in this.
So just a quick follow-up question. I'm very interested in hearing your thoughts. If there were a reference implementation that were free, open source, reduce all the friction for you, would that be okay? As instead of having to eyeball the markup, you would just throw it in this reference implementation and see it rendered, and there you could compare it to your source document.
No, I don't think anyone's going to leave the reference on that. You need to look at the XML.
Nobody will.
I did not understand how this works out.
Oh. Well, if
compare it visually.
You can compare it visually.
Reference score against your PDF or whatever.
But reference implementation would not refer to my special case. To all this what I see in my daily work, and where I have to go through and find why the car messes up with this file this morning again. I had some corrupt XML, and I was happy to see what happens left and right. And I would like to avoid that I have to, it's like Sommerzeit and Winterzeit. You have to go towards housing is pain.
In Primus, if I remember correctly with Primus, you have in the program, the display of the MusicXML for a particular part. Is that, so you
Yes,
want so a reference implementation doesn't really help in debugging your thing, because you're seeing what my program is displaying and what does it think the MusicXML is.
So it's displaying the literal XML code.
Mm-hmm. It should show you what the MNX file is supposed to look like. That's the point. That's what a reference implementation does. Shows you what the MNX file is supposed to look like, so then you can tell whether you have a bug in your code, because if it doesn't look like the reference implementation, it's your bug. That's the idea behind reference implementation.
But you still have to go back to the XML as a programmer. If your reference program tells you there's a mistake, then you have to go back and look at your XML.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
but I don't think programmers can really avoid reading XML when they're working with XML
yes.
files.
So you can't just,
sort of the job in a way.
You can't just have a reference implementation.
No, indeed.
So you had your hand up for a long time. So.
I'd like to give both a philosophical and a technical answer to that question. You said that music is sound. In that case, we never have heard music from Bach, Beethoven, or Mozart, or anyone of those composers. We have no sound from that. All we have is paper. And so, paper is also music. Printed music is, or written music is music. So I don't buy that argument that only sound is music. The technical answer is, let's think about our naive encoder, OMR. It's much harder to actually understand the transposing instrument than scanning in score. And if we would encode this as written pitch, it would be much easier to get not the right sound already, but I would suspect that it's much easier for software to adjust the transposing of the full stuff throughout the score than to realign all the pitches and make sure that they match up correctly. Because you probably run into different accidentals and stuff like that, and it will be a much more of a mess than if you start with the printed score. So I see no reason to have the sounding pitch as the primary. I'm not saying that I would restrict to just the sounding pitch. I would actually have both in there. And it could be two attributes, one called sounding pitch and one written pitch, something like that.
But if you've already premised that your program is going to be faulty, which you seem to be doing, then there will be errors in the file you'll create with the wrong written or sounding pitches that don't tally with each other. Whereas if you have just one, then you know that it's correct.
I'm not arguing about whether we should have both or not. I'm just saying if we have only one, it should be the written one. That's the statement I want to make now. The other one is a different discussion. And actually, that's the way MI does it. Just as a side note.
That's why MusicXML
I haven't got a question that MEI hasn't solved.
Oh, challenge accepted.
Who's been waiting a long
Oh,
time?
go ahead. Go ahead.
No.
All right, so first from a philosophical sound standpoint, I see a piece of sheet music as a composer's way of communicating with a musician. It is a way of getting what is in a composer's head into what a musician can perform with. So from that point of view, I do in fact view the sound as the end result, the idea that we are trying to communicate. However, as a person who works for a publishing firm, we work very hard to make sure that the notes line up properly, that the slurs are tall enough that they don't intersect the notations that are on top of the notes, that the notes point the right way, that there are the right spacing between the notes. And this sort of thing needs to be correctly sent. When we send this to somebody else or we are importing it from somewhere else, we want that information to come along with it. So even if we are going to then turn it into something else, we want to at least be able to correctly reproduce the original written document. I feel like we need to break down both pieces of information, the written pitch, the sounding pitch, so that the original document can be reproduced, but the sounding pitch, which is the end result of the music, the desired result of the music, can be correctly interpreted, can be found. We need to have both pieces of information. Is that?
Who's next?
Go ahead.
Yeah,
I'm going to ramble for a while, so go ahead.
I have two reactions. What is grounded truth, as sound or visual display? I think it's both, but as a good point that it's if the parts are meshed, you just pissed off all players in orchestra, and they don't want to make the sound from bad parts. So I think that is visual display is also equally as a sound is equal. And the second is about we talking about how to combine something like sounding, writing, everything. I think it's a time for AI to help us to really. It's important that need to be. It's important to say that we program like obstacles to obstacles, and we cannot figure it out how put things together. Like for if there's some hacks or some things to do in a programming, it's now. But I think that the point is, if we can use like for neural networks, the process that could bring much information from one sheet, they can handle everything there. Is like MIDI or picture or something. It's much better to do it that way than program in separate way how to manage the soundings of notes, or how to manage a part between parts and scores. I think it's important to how interact these both worlds, the visual and sound. So I think that
Yeah.
I want to hear the band.
Okay, so here's the thing: is I listened to all this, and I think that there's not a consensus on what the hell MNX is. Like, what is it trying to solve? What is who is it really for? And what is the priority of who's it for? Is it for the developer? Is it for the composer? Is it for the performer? And by the way, nothing should ever be like great artists. Composers should go through pain for their art. You know, developers should go through pain for their art. So no, I mean what I mean here is that everything should always be in service of the end user. And anything that simplifies something for the developer should be in service of simplifying it for the end user. So the idea there's a lot of great solutions out there that are really simple for developers, but it starts to break and fall apart when you get to the end user. So backing up further, like in a much higher level, is MNX a transformation format? Is it a native format? What is MNX? And the idea is I think about in the context of, we're here speaking English. Well, English is a native format, but it's also a transitional format. It's a language that people communicate in that is non-native. But if this is the difference between us speaking Esperanto or Latin, versus speaking here in English. It is a live format that people invest in. Right? And so I think the idea here, what excites me and gets me really interested is a common native format, because then there is a difference in a level of investment in that format than if it's just a transitional format. So that's one point. The other point is saying, okay, well, what should be in that format and what shouldn't be in that format? When I look at the issue of transposition, I don't think it should be in the file format at all, like period. That's the point is, I think that we should have definition of the instrument. What does that instrument do and how does that instrument affect that particular interpretation of it? Because maybe I wanted to switch and change another instrument and it would interpret that information differently. We're putting in unnecessary code, right? And when I look at this in the file format, how can reduce in its most simplest form and look at transform, the way that we transform it. And then also contextually, I think one point that we have here is we're thinking way too much about a fixed format and fixed presentation. And that's, from a publishing standpoint, that's very important when you have a house style and how you want to present it. But we live in a fluid world. We live in a world where there is the way it should be displayed on different devices and different environments can be different. And we should be designing and thinking for a music streaming. What does music notation streaming look like? Not paper. And what are the unique advantages of digital versus how do we create very portable paper? And the idea of engraving, I think, should be entirely abstracted from this. And I don't see the future of humans actually doing that. And I think engraving changes based upon the context of the environment. You make choices of degradation based upon, let's say, the type of environment. But I think putting all those in a standard, if we flipped it the other way and we said, hey, what is a common native format? It would make entirely different design choices rather than to create a new digital format for cassette, right?
2 quick reactions. Check out that introduction to MNX-Common document. I tried to answer that question, but it does mention the native format. And then the second thing is, I'm totally on board with the responsive notation. The thing that I make, Soundslice, is all about responsive notation, and we throw out line breaks and all that data anyway. So I totally 100% agree with that.
Yeah, I speaking from that, we need to be able to put in the line breaks, or the publishers, the big publishers are probably not going to buy in. Okay? Okay? But I also agree that such things need to be put in their own space as a layout instructions that are separate from the general semantics of the note. What comes out as problems is where do you put your up and down stem instructions then? Where do you put things like that? Do they go into the layout or do they not? And I don't know. But we too, we have an app, we have a digital presence. We too wish we could lay it out on a non-page, page-by-page format and still have it look nice. So we're supportive of responsive layouts at Music Notes. We want that. That is a good thing. But which I think contradicts something what I was saying.
Yeah, but
both of them.
how do you do that?
I want to talk about this and feel where we're coming from. Because the problem with a transposed instrument, and this is separate, we will make sure that we're not talking about algorithmically transposing an entire score into another key. That is different from representing a transposed instrument. Those are two, they use the same words, but they are two different concepts musically. A transposed instrument, if you were to try to represent the original, but a part that had the transposed instrument and the original score and a full composer score that did not have, and then had it in, and has it in concert pitch. In the same document, you start ending up with having to specify every single written pitch and for both of them, and it starts getting very complicated very fast. Do we do that anyway? Do we specify the sounding pitch and both written spellings? And the spelling is important in a lot of things. Is it a G or is it an F sharp sharp? It can be very important for layout purposes, and I personally dislike F sharp sharp. I find it less readable than a G, but that is something that other people, especially online, have specified as being a very important distinction.
That's not necessarily a written pitch, it could be a sounding
F sharp sharp as from a sounding, an F sharp sharp is a G.
I guess, yeah.
But not in D sharp major, then it's F double sharp.
But I need the area.
I know I'm being a little bit incoherent, not making a definite position here.
Yeah.
To talk about.
So if you think about it in this context, let's say, for example, what delegations should there be? What choices should be? When you coming from the publisher side, when you have a house style and you have all this stuff, the publisher is delegating everything, or the composer is delegating everything, and the user is just consuming. And when we live in a digital world, we have opportunity to make choices, to delegate some of those choices to the user based upon their preferences. So maybe I'm, for some weird reason, so I play, let's say if I play B flat clarinet, for some weird reason, I just love to read that same part, always in alto clef. So why can't I make that choice? It's not, none of these choices are made in the document. The document itself is just whatever the base level thing is. All these other choices become delegations to the user, and opportunities to delegate these choices to the user become the various different implementations of that standard.
I think the good news is, regardless of what solution we come up with, that will always be possible, because it doesn't matter how you store it. If you're talking about transposing, changing the clef on the fly, changing the instrument on the fly, it's almost a separate question that doesn't even need to be addressed in the format, because what we want to capture in the transposition is exactly what you're saying. It's the other transposition. It's how was it written in the first place and construed by the composer in the first place, as opposed to making it dynamic. The dynamic stuff.
I guess
once you start saying, I'm going to make it look different than it originally did, your algorithm can do whatever the hell it wants.
Yeah, the publisher.
Well, yeah, but I mean, I guess there's.
If you're going to make it a horizontal layout, if you're going to make a transposed part when it was originally a concert pitch, you can do, your algorithm can do what it wants. You don't have to specify that.
But you're only encoding the original, like at time of page load if it's a web app.
Right.
What is it going to be? So that's.
But here's the thing: is that there is that fixed academic definition of what that is, and that fixed academic definition of what is correct in engraving and all these things goes back to the tradition of paper. There is no new fixed academic standard for digital. For example, digital format. What do you need? What do you need repeats for? What do you need jumps, voltas? They don't. Why? That's you don't need those things anymore. There's all these things that are unnecessary in a pure digital format. But why do those things exist anymore? So the idea of, and this is a cool thing, by the way. What I see, Dorico moves in that direction of separating the concept of write from engrave, and thinking about from the standard that we have. There are definitions and choices that are made in writing, and there's definitions of choice in engraving, and there's interpretive definitions that the user should have. And every individual user should be able to, maybe I like if I like slurs, maybe I like a little loop in my slurs. Cool. And I can do what I want if it's meaningful to me.
I will say that repeats do have a use for a performer, because you know then that this is exactly the same thing that I just played. You don't have to practice it in a different way. You don't have to wait and see if there's going to be something different. That being said, I agree that being able to just keep scrolling to the right is also a useful thing for a performer, rather than having to flip back.
Let's get some new voices.
So we can go right down.
I would strongly support Christoph in his first speech, and I would say that your example of F## is a very good example, and it shows us that written pitch is really what we are going to encode. If we only want to encode sounding pitch, we could restrict ourselves to what MIDI can. And we have no double sharp in MIDI, as far as I know.
Well, hexadecimals would still be encoded, to be clear.
Okay, but it's a compromise. It's in the end, it's a compromise. In order to be able to reproduce written scores from MIDI. For me, it's really the question, the people who are dealing with the scores are the developers, and I'm just one of those kinds who don't believe that any importer-exporter written from MusicXML to MNX will be 100%. I'm pretty sure we sometimes have to look at the MNX and at the XML as well. And the long future is, of course, to have native MNX exporters and to avoid the shortcomings of XML, to avoid things we certainly will lose if our own native formats are first transformed to MusicXML and then to MNX. In spite of every effort Michael will really do. I appreciate these efforts very much. But, so there are also many situations where enharmonic conversion is really a choice of the editor, and we want to encode this choice of the editor. So, despite the fact that the second thing is that our own format from Capella, of course, uses written pitch as well, and so it's more familiar for me, and people who deal with scores are also what they are talking about is for me the important thing. So I would strongly encourage the MNX standard to stick to the written.
So may I also confirm my view is the same as yours and as Mr. Schatz. Before I joined the music stuff here, I was only a very basic guitar player. And I said, F sharp and G, F sharp sharp and G. Oh, what a mess, it's a G, full stop. Now I learned there's a big difference between F sharp sharp and a G. Therefore, I think the priority is really to have it F sharp sharp if the composer says F sharp sharp. However, immediately it comes to the point that it needs to sound. So and sounding is because music is sound. So our philosophy is always, in notation software is always, it needs to be sound as the original. However, it needs to follow the guidelines of the editor of the notation. So for me, printing is number one, priority one, and the second is, of course, sounding needs to be in there because it's music. Because if there is a MusicXML or anything coming along and it's being printed in a nice call, the user, the musician will immediately say, how does it listen? Press the playback button. And if this is not accurate, then the music is wrong. So, but from a view perspective, my view is the written needs to fit, but secondly, it needs to sound accurate.
Still, how do you think, in the common context, how do you think an F sharp sharp sounds differently from a G? How would you, if that's your...
It's in theory of how it's recorded.
If that's your issue.
There's knowing that something's a sharp 4 versus a flat 5 is...
It's just what it's called in that scale, isn't it?
It's giving you exactly how out of tune to play.
It's a few hertz difference.
In the concentration is different as a habit.
He has difference. There are completely different notes. It's music theory from 400 years ago.
I think we're getting a bit mixed up, aren't we, though, between two things. Written pitch can include F double sharp, totally fine, right? Sounding pitch, likewise, can include F double sharp, totally fine. I think what we're not saying is, regardless of whether we think we're encoding written pitch as in what a transposing instrument sees, or a player playing transposing sees, which could be F double sharp or G according to what key you're in or whatever else. It's certainly not we want to limit how we describe the pitch. No, the point is the note name, as it were, the thing that you hear, or the thing that the player playing the instrument is reading? That's all we're saying. F double sharp is kind of a red herring. Yeah. It's kind of a red herring, I'm sorry to say.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. It is a good example on one level in that, you know, it tells us that certainly we do not want to limit our definition of pitch to something, you know, we don't even want to limit it to double sharps and triple sharps and quadruple sharps. We should be able to encode, you know, I mean, maybe not in MNX-Common, or at least not in the standard stuff, but if you want to do, you know, whatever very extended microtonal thing, that ought to be possible represented as well. But the point is, when we call a note by its name, whether it's an F or a G or an A or a B or whatever it is that the note name that you are hearing, or is it the note name that the player is reading? And I think we've kind of wandered a little bit off-piste in this conversation by worrying about accidentals, which I think have to be encoded the same way regardless of which of those pitches we're actually encoding. So I just want to try and just drag us back a little bit onto the topic. I'm not going to say who's going to speak next, though.
Well, James and Wilkins have been waiting quite a while.
Well, yeah. To me, music is sound. Thinking of this transposing, I think it is possible without loss. But there must be a precondition to say this. This is that you have to know both which key you are transposing from and to, and you must be able to set double accidentals, so sharp. Then you can make it. But thinking about this and fighting for the sound, I noticed that it was mentioned on the net that you could specify both. And this seemed to me to solve a lot of problems, because we are free, we won't put any limit on it. Someone wanting microtones, he can just do as he wants. And with the folk music that sometimes has some bends, or you could say some also microtones, wouldn't have problem that the tone may not be exactly on some of the 24 tones, notes, pitches that we have. Then it can still be noted like the writer wanted. And the problem that occurs is that a tone is a little lower maybe than another tone, and therefore the distance is not so big, and all the notations programs will consider it, oh, it's the other tone over this tone. But the writer needs to maybe write a B on that note because it is lower than the other note. So it seems to me that the double specification is perfect. There can be some redundancy, but I think it's not a disaster. We should not have too much, of course, but it seems to me be okay. And the readability, the musician does not read the XML. So I think it will still be readable, but it would not bother a person who played this stuff with a clarinet in BB, because he would have some program writing the score. So therefore, I think the double specification is a good idea.
Yes, I think that this needs, I think we need to involve microphones from the beginning, and that the double solution is the answer. Because I think that if you are trying to produce a MIDI representation of the score, from the information in the score, then you need to know basically what MIDI pitch this note is, the SU. And that's quite independent of what it looks like. So we don't need to, I would propose that you don't use transposition as you haven't actually, you always use transposition as the transposition from a default pitch in your examples. And I think it would be better to use an absolute pitch for the pitch definition and use transposition. If you define pitch as a MIDI pitch, I would use MIDI pitch in an extended version. I would say, let's say we can use sense, so you could use 60.25 for a quarter tone above 60. Then I could make a MIDI transcription of this piece by adjusting the appropriate MIDI controls. But I don't know what pitch it's supposed to be. And if I determined that pitch and said that this is going to be, and I left out the graphical representation, then the program would have to say, well, this is a middle C, and so then put a middle C. So it's a question of your defaults, whether you default, if you have a graph. If I write a middle C, I can have a default which is MIDI 60. Like if you leave out the graphics, you can use pitch, and vice versa, or both. If you write a middle C, you'd say this is going to sound a bit sharp, or you write an F double sharp, and you say this is going to be a bit sharper than an ordinary G, or this is a leading note, and then you can make it a bit sharper. And you could also define note styles globally, so you could define a scale of 53 notes to the octave, and define them as a class. Does that make sense?
I think so. Matthias and Cyril, I know we're both.
Just an idea from my experience with getting Braille from different kind of formats. If you have a software, the software has something you want to do with it. It can be something with sound or something with rotation, or with in EI you have some original scores that you want to have a layer of modern score around it. So you have a function what you want to do with your software. And this software, this function needs a specific language, needs a specific music notation, which is perfect for the software, for the idea of the software. So if two softwares do nearly the same, you don't need different formats, but if the software are doing different things, then you need different formats. And now you are thinking about making one format that is fitting everything. And this is, I think, something that will be very complicated, and there will be always people who have benefit from some decision and some persons who have no benefit from a decision. So if you find out 4 or 5 different kinds of ideas what you want to have, which kind of software exists, and which kind of notation is good for the software, then you can, for example, define 5 different MNX formats and provide a transformer that transforms the notes from one format to another. And this is for everybody, and everybody can get the format that he wants for his project and use this format as he wants. And not after with this, not everybody is implementing everything, but every kind of transformation is only implemented once, and everybody can get the format like he wants to get it for his specific project.
The problem that I have with that is the same problem. Sorry.
We're trying to get everybody to Cyril. I know have been waiting because we're running short on time.
Sorry.
I want to say that if, well, for the record, I prefer to have the visual encoded, but I think that whatever we choose, like for the DOS, we can do an accurate algorithmic translation with the transpose information we have, like with the diatonic and the chromatic. However, it's not the case for the key signature. We don't have enough information encoded to, I mean, in MusicXML right now, to make the accurate translation. Sometimes we get the wrong unharmonics. Whatever we choose, I think we need to add this information to get the correct transposition for this key signature. My second point would be that if you want to have like some specific layout, like system breaks, I think we either need redundancy or, as you say, have like some kind of layout space in the format where you can have the global layout on the part layout.
I think it's a separation of responsibilities. What are we trying to digitize here to encode? In my opinion, it is music notation, so it's a visual state of music. For who are we trying to do this? I think it's for the performer, not for the listener, because the performer has to execute what he sees to make music for the listener. So I think if you think about those statements, then it's clear that it needs to be encoded as a visual pitch instead of a sound pitch.
The conductor might see a different sounding pitch in the full score, and the part would be transposed.
Again, written pitch does not need to be transposed pitch. If you're encoding a concert score, the written pitch is outside of instruments that are octave transposed, equivalent to the sounding pitch.
Yeah, there is one thing which shouldn't be forgot. However it might be implemented, there is one instrument which is a non-transposing instrument, the harp, but which is often changed enharmonically just because of the technique of the harp player. So when you're playing in, say, B major, you would write the harp in C flat major. And so this special case should not be forgotten in the encoding, however it is done.
I would be in favor of not duplicating the data, just for a viewpoint of development and data consistency. The second point is that I also agree of encoding the notation, because obviously this is for music notation. It's not for a MIDI sequencer type of. So as we focus on notation, I think it should be better to encode the notated value, because when we want to make the music play, it's one line of code to ask to just the MIDI transposition, and the reverse is not true. So I would just as an optimization of the code, that's very easy to do. I mean, and if we want, the last point is, if we want to use this format as native format, we have the data. At some point, we need to display it on the screen. So we have to have the data match as much as possible what will be on the screen. And if we have to transpose the notation on the fly just to display it, that will be very difficult to do and processing consuming. Whether, in the contrary, if we want to take the notation value and then ask just +1 of plus the transposition in MIDI, that's very easy to do also. That would be my remarks on that. If we want to use it as a native format, I think.
Dominique, I didn't get the first one.
The first one is just no redundancy of duplication of data.
No duplication.
No duplication of data.
Of course, as a programmer, you hate duplication, but then we would agree on a generative format, on something that can produce all these things, and I don't see it. You have a slur which could be broken in the parts, and the broken parts of the slur will be user-defined, and how will you have a tree of possibilities? How you generate?
I think this was just for pitch, not for every type of data in the score.
Who hasn't said anything?
It's literally just a pitch. Any objections I can think of using only the sounding pitch are the examples that Mike showed, because it's an editorial decision sometimes, the tenor sax or whatever, or the piecing which is different from what you might otherwise expect. And then the other thing is that editors, speaking of engraver editors, frequently make enharmonic changes in the colors. So you can't just have sounding pitch there, there have to be some additional information somewhere. And I'm sure there's something I've forgotten, there must be other issues. People have been bringing up all sorts of obvious things like slurs and stem directions and whatever, but if you're just talking about pitch, then those are the only two things I can think of right now that are an issue only using sound pitch.
There's redundant data recognized that were optional, so you don't put in the redundant data when it was necessary. So that you don't have
one idea. It could be programs who do not care about sound at all. So if we have the written as a primary data, it's much easier for these programs to deal with that. If you don't care about sound, you don't need the sound. And it should be 100% compatible. If I don't get any sound information, that should also work because you just display rotation.
Who else hasn't spoken?
I would also opt in favor of visual display. And maybe I would have the first question is here, are we encoding musical ideas in musical documents? I would have stated the question in different ways. So my question would have been, we all agree that we have different perspectives on something we're describing. So my question would have been, what is the semantic level of the description, and what is the performance description of, and what is the presentation description? And I think these levels should also all be present in the specification, in the description. But ultimately, I would say the semantics is about music notation. It's not about how music sounds, but how it is written. And therefore, I would opt clearly for the visual display as the basic representation, which does not say that we have to get rid or omit other information. All has to be present in the score, but the basic representation should be, in my opinion, should be based on visual display or not on sound.
Just one last note, sorry. From a non-developer, I'd opt for the visual representation as well. What we're recording is the recipe, not the muffins. So generally, I mean, we're not trying to deliver 1,000 discrete packets of muffin. We're trying to give the instructions that a consumer would then use to make the end result. I understand wanting to record the end result with Houston singing all of the notes that are on the page and then 1,000 other ones that aren't on the page, making the sound different from the notation. So in my opinion, the thing that we're trying to record is that recipe that needs to be conveyed to the performer in whatever context to make the thing.
Are there other people who haven't?
Last one.
And I just want to make sure if anybody else has not weighed in on this. Because we are about to be at refreshments.
Joe started this work defining roles and a huge list of roles.
Yes.
I think one important word there, and it was the developer, and that I addressed. And I would ask him are we having a common perception that the fun developing XML again, let's make it fun again, is very high priority and is not excluding, like we said, the consumer will benefit from this when we are heavily working on XML MNX and are enjoying well-defined constructs and the parallelism between written and printed and coded stuff. And is anybody here putting this in doubt?
I think we should.
In a way, the Maxine.
I think this would be a good time to wrap. We could obviously keep discussing this on and on and on, so I'm sorry, I have to cut somebody off at some time.
Should we take a vote?
No. What I'd like to do for next steps is we have lots of this information, we have lots of people's perspectives, so as co-chairs we will take this and what has been written and come up with a recommendation for how to proceed and present that to the group, and we do that in the near future. Yes, the next step, because it was great to really, we heard from so many more people than we have heard from in discussions, and it's a little overwhelming to have all this presented at once. But thankfully, thanks to Daniel for recording this.
4,320 words.
Daniel for taking copious notes. We need to go back and review this and come up with a decision, but I think it's been extremely helpful. And with that, we're at the end of the slideshow, and the refreshments are here, thanks to Capella. Thanks very much, everybody, for participating.